On January 13th, 1991, the Los Angeles Raiders defeated the Cincinnati Bengals to advance to the AFC Championship game. This matchup may be most remembered for being Bo Jackson's last NFL game. But as for the Bengals, after the conclusion of this divisional round loss to the Raiders, a remarkably long period would ensue involving a lot of losing football. So the 1990 Cincinnati Bengals, they did win the AFC Central Division, going 9-7. They won a playoff game against Houston, but then lost their previously mentioned Raiders. But then, on August 5th, 1991, the legendary Paul Brown, the founder of the Cincinnati Bengals, he passed away. This led to Paul Brown's son Mike to be in control and to become the general manager for the NFL team that dons helmets with black stripes. And from this point on, it'd be rough for the Cincinnati Bengals faithful. Mike Brown has had a reputation for running the Bengals more like a mom and pop shop and also for being cheap. But for me, here's what really comes to mind regarding the Cincinnati Bengals in the 90s. The scouting department, the drafting and development of players, which is probably the worst in the NFL in the 90s. What I kept hearing and realizing was that Cincinnati did a horrible job investing in their scouting department. During this period, Cincinnati had the fewest scouts and were extremely undermanned in that department. So with Mike Brown now owning the Bengals, for the 1991 NFL season, Cincinnati, they went 3-13 with the worst defense, allowing numerous yards through the air, as their defensive backfield was pretty thin this season. Fan favorite head coach Sam Wyche, who led the Bengals to their second Super Bowl appearance for the 1988 season, he would not return. There was a dispute whether or not Wyche was fired or if he resigned. Mike Brown said Wyche resigned so he didn't have to pay the final 2 years of his contract, but Wyche claimed he was fired. Also not returning would be defensive coordinator Dick LeBeau, who was a DC with Cincinnati during the Sam Wyche era. Then there was fan favorite 30-year-old quarterback Boomer Esiason, who was coming off of a tough season. Perhaps was he declining? Well, for the 1992 NFL Draft, after a trade down, Cincinnati, they'd select 6th and would take quarterback David Klingler. Also for the 92 NFL Draft, they would have another first-round pick and selected safety Darrell Williams, who would be a starter and then a Pro Bowler later on for Seattle. And in that second round, Cincinnati, they also took wide receiver Carl Pickens. I'll talk more about Klingler and Pickens later on, because what I need to get to is who would replace Sam Wyche as the new head coach of the Cincinnati Bengals. That'd be 32-year-old Dave Shula, and back then it was crazy to hire a coach that young. Shula was the Bengals wide receiver coach in 1991. According to NFL Network's episode of the Top 10 Worst Teams, apparently the next Bengals head coach came down to Shula and Bill Cowher. Former Bengals guard and Bengals broadcaster Dave Lapham thought that Mike Brown went with Dave Shula because he lived in a big shadow of his father, Don Shula. Mike Brown lived in a big shadow of his father, Paul Brown, so it was almost like a kindred spirit there. Now Cowher, he wound up becoming a great coach of Pittsburgh, but from my point of view, it's hard to imagine that Cowher would have the same success in Cincinnati like he did in Pittsburgh. Anyway, the 1992 Cincinnati Bengals, with Dave Shula leading the way, they went 5-11. Running back Harold Green was a Pro Bowler this season. Meanwhile, Boomer Esiason, he'd start 12 games, and Klingler, he'd start the other 4. But after the season, Anthony Munoz, who played all of his 13 years in the NFL with the Bengals, perhaps the greatest offensive lineman ever, he would retire. Enter the 1993 season, and I'll start off by talking about Boomer Esiason, who had his worst NFL season in 1992, as he was one of the lowest rated passers. Esiason wound up being traded to the New York Jets. Supposedly, Esiason didn't want to back up David Klingler. For the 1993 NFL Draft, Cincinnati, they drafted defensive end John Copeland from Alabama, 5th overall. So I've always kind of thought of Copeland as a bust, but perhaps it's kind of unfair because Copeland, he did become a mainstay on the Bengals defensive line for 8 years and was better defending against the run. In the second round, the Bengals had drafted Tony McGee, who wound up being a decent pass-catching tight end. So the 93 Cincinnati Bengals, with Boomer Esiason gone, it's now David Klingler time. However, the Bengals started off the season going 0-10 and finished the 93 season going 3-13. The offense averaged less than 12 points a game, which was last in the NFL. So with that said, a change would be made at offensive coordinator, as Bruce Coslet would be the new OC. So Coslet was the New York Jets head coach, was fired after the 93 season. Coslet was the Bengals' offensive coordinator from 1985 to 1989, was a big part of making the Bengals have one of the top offenses in the late 80s with the no-huddle system. So Coslet returns, and later on, I want to talk about a very important acquisition that was made because of Coslet. But from the 94 NFL Draft, with the first overall selection, Cincinnati, they drafted defensive lineman Dan Wilkinson. Alright, so Dan, Big Daddy Wilkinson, had quite the physical talent. The Ohio State product was tremendous, leaving many in awe at the combine. However, of course, this selection did not pan out. There were glimpses of his talent, but he was inconsistent and questions arose about Wilkinson's desire and will to be great. I think worth mentioning is that the Bengals, they tried to build a great defensive line with Wilkinson and John Copeland. I also want to mention that Cincinnati's first round pick in 1991 was defensive end / outside linebacker Alfred Williams, who would leave after the 94 season in free agency, then become a first team All-Pro with Denver. But anyways, with this young talent on that D-line, it looked promising, but it didn't work out. Last item to mention about the 94 draft, in the second round, Cincinnati, they selected speedster wide receiver Darnay Scott, who, if anyone cares, is my favorite Cincinnati Bengal of all time. But Scott, he would wind up making some big plays for the Bengals. Alright, so the 1994 Cincinnati Bengals, they started off with an 0-7 record, with poor play and an elbow injury to David Klingler. And also, second-string quarterback Donald Hollis, he was injured. So you have the Cincinnati Bengals team lacking in talent. They now have to play their third-string quarterback. Being inserted into the starting QB role was this unknown, drafted player in the 6th round by the Jets out of East Carolina in 1992. He wasn't physically imposing, he was on the smaller side, and there's no way this guy was going to be the savior of the Cincinnati Bengals. Well, I'm going to say yes, because in a way, Jeff Blake will be like a savior for the Bengals. I'll explain more about this later on, but let me just hit on a couple of items. First, the 94 Cincinnati Bengals, they finished 3-13. So with two new expansion teams, Cincinnati, they had 5th pick, but they traded up to have the first overall selection, and that pick wound up being running back Kijana Carter from Penn State. So Carter, he impressed me with a 7.8 yards per carry during his final season at Penn State. He had the quickness and explosiveness. But in the first preseason game, Kijana Carter, he blew out his knee and an ACL injury, missed the entire 95 season. It wouldn't be the same, as this was a tough blow, as Carter was expected to change direction of the Bengals franchise. And I'd love to see a healthy Kijana Carter with what was about to transpire in 1995. So back to this guy, Jeff Blake, who came out of nowhere. He showed he had the ability to make big throws as he led the NFL in yards per completion in 1994, but in 1995, I'm just going to say, Blake was awesome for Cincinnati during this season. And yes, I'll call him the savior because it was so bad, so dim, so bleak regarding Bengals football. But Blake was a huge part of bringing a new vibe, excitement, and competitive football back to the Queen City. There was this fresh, positive energy now associated with the Bengals with Jeff Blake in 1995, as Bengals fans really needed this. So Jeff Blake in 1995, he made the Pro Bowl, threw for 28 touchdowns, and recorded over 3,800 yards, which was pretty good back then. The first item that comes to mind for me about Jeff Blake is that he threw one of the best deep balls ever. I think he put the most air under the ball when he threw the deep ball. When the new Dallas Cowboys Stadium was being built and there were concerns that a punter might hit the low-hanging giant scoreboard, I was thinking, screw that. Blake, he'd be hitting that scoreboard with one of his deep balls if he was playing. But anyways, so out of nowhere, the Bengals, they may have found the franchise quarterback, and a large part of that had to do with offense coordinator Bruce Coslet, who was familiar with Blake when Coslet was a head coach of the Jets, as Coslet lobbied for the Bengals to acquire Blake. So additionally, I'm finally now going to talk about Carl Pickens. So in 1995, this was the year of the wide receiver, as this season has always fascinated with me, as wide receiver numbers exploded. In 1995, Herman Moore and Chris Carter posted the highest total for receptions in the season with 123 and 122 respectively. Moreover, Jerry Rice and Isaac Bruce, they posted the highest total of receiving yards in a season in 1995, with Rice having 1,848 yards and Bruce having 1,781 yards. But the player who had the most touchdown receptions in 1995 was Carl Pickens, as he and Chris Carter, they led the NFL with 17. Pickens in 1995 had 99 receptions for 1,234 yards and made the Pro Bowl. In addition, Darnay had over 800 yards receiving, averaging over 15 yards a catch, and Tony McGee was also a reliable option to catch passes at the tight end position, and I wish Kajana Carter was healthy this season. It was fun following the Bengals from my point of view in 1995, even though they finished with a 7-9 record. Finally, enthusiasm was back regarding the Cincinnati Bengals. For the 1996 NFL Draft, the Bengals, they'd be selected 10th. One item that I haven't talked about is the offensive line. In the early 90s, the O-line, they struggled, and up to this point, it needed improvements. With that said, with the 10th selection, Cincinnati, they hit a home run with their selection with offensive tackle Willie Anderson, who had become one of the best, if not the best right tackle in the 2000s. So a lot of excitement with the Bengals heading into the 96 NFL season. However, Cincinnati, they started off with a 1-6 record. Dave Shula, he'd then be fired, and Bruce Coslett would now take over as a head coach. And to finish off the season, Cincinnati finished with a 7-2 record as Jeff Blake, he played much better. Hence Cincinnati, they finished with an 8-8 record and missed the playoffs once again. Carl Pickens in 1996 once again made the Pro Bowl. Pickens recorded 100 receptions in 1996, which is third in the NFL, first in the AFC. Also recorded 1,180 yards and 12 touchdowns. The 12 touchdowns was third in the NFL. The other Bengals Pro Bowler this season was cornerback Ashley Ambrose, who was signed as a free agent. Enter the 1997 NFL season, and Bruce Coslett would remain as a head coach. Also, I want to mention Cincinnati, they slightly changed their uniforms, putting a Bengal tiger on the sleeve, and I love these uniforms. But anyways, next item to get to, once again, Cincinnati, they did not hit with the first round pick, 14th overall, and linebacker Bernard Wilson, who lasted 6 seasons in the NFL, all with Cincinnati, was a starter in only one of those seasons. But in the second round, Cincinnati, they finally solved the running back position problem by selecting Corey Dillon, who would wind up being one of the best running backs in the NFL. The 1997 Bengals, who finished strong the previous season with Bruce Coslett leading the way. However, that Jeff Blake magic, it was gone as Cincinnati started off with a 3-8 record, and Blake was not the same quarterback as he only threw 8 touchdown passes during those 11 games. Now, Boomer Esiason, he would return to Cincinnati as this would be his final NFL season. Esiason came in and started the final 5 games and played really well. He had a passer rating of 106.9, which was awesome back then. And Cincinnati, they finished strong once again to end the season with a 7-9 record. Enter the 1998 NFL season, and for this year's draft, this may have been Cincinnati's best draft class of the decade. So I know I've been mostly talking about Cincinnati's first round picks, who they hit on, and also who they hit on in the second round, but additionally, Cincinnati, they did not draft well in the later rounds. They did not find a lot of solid contributors in these later rounds. So back to the 1998 NFL draft, Cincy, they selected linebacker Takeo Spikes, who was a really good linebacker, but was only in Cincinnati for 5 years after he left for Buffalo in free agency. Furthermore, 4 more starters were drafted in 1998, and linebacker Brian Simmons, defensive back Archel Hawkins, and linebacker Steve Foley, and guard Mike Goff. The 1998 Cincinnati Bengals, they would not have Jeff Blake to start under center, but instead it'd be Neil O'Donnell, who beat out Blake to be the starter in training camp. The Bengals, they went backward. Had the 3rd selection in the 1999 NFL Draft, they selected quarterback Achilles Smith, as Smith, he struggled greatly in the NFL. The 1999 Cincinnati Bengals, they would have Jeff Blake start 12 games. He went 3-9 in those games, and then be helping the New Orleans Saints win some games the following season. The 1999 Cincinnati Bengals, they went 4-12. In the decade of the 90s, the Bengals, they went 52-108. The 108 losses were the most for an NFL franchise in a decade at the time. But let me finish by saying this. Here are the records of the Bengals in 2000, 2001, and 2002. As you can see, seems like the same old Bengals. But then in 2003, the Bengals, they went outside the family to hire someone who was a hot coaching candidate in Marvin Lewis. Cincinnati is probably the worst coaching job at this time. But for the Bengals to get Lewis to lead the franchise, Lewis wanted changes to the scouting department and to the facilities, and wanted the Bengals to have more interest in free agents. Moreover, Lewis had some same personnel decisions and was able to hire his assistant coaches. Say what you want to say about Marvin Lewis. I do think he was a good coach, a very competent coach who can lead an NFL team. I'm not going to get into the Marvin Lewis era, but what I will say is that the Bengals franchise changed greatly with Marvin Lewis, and these changes as the drafting and developing of players was greatly improved, and Cincinnati was competing for division titles. Thank you so much for your interest in this video. I greatly appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for all the support.